Sourdough bread is great, but it takes forever to make because it relies solely on the leavening from the sourdough starter. If you have time, it's great, but if you want the taste of sourdough but on a shorter schedule, I can show you how today. It still uses sourdough starter, but it also includes some yeast so you'll get faster rise. This particular recipe is actually based on the rustic sourdough bread recipe that you can find on the King Arthur Flour website. I'll include a link below.
So we're going to begin with the software. First off, you're going to need 225 grams, or about a cup, of active sourdough starter. Now, I'm working with a San Francisco variety that I cultivated in whole wheat flour. I ordered this a few months ago as an active culture from a company called Breadtopia. Great company. I'll include a link to it below. This stuff is great. It kicked right off. I was actually able to use it within about a day. I have whole wheat and bread flour starters, but for this recipe I'm using whole wheat because I think that it gives a stronger sourdough flavor, which we really will need since we're not relying 100% on the starter to leaven the bread. Now we also going to need 340 milliliters, or about a cup and a half, of lukewarm water. Depending on your environment, you may use all of it, or if you live in a high humidity area like I do, start with a cup or maybe a cup and a quarter and reserve the rest only if you need it. I usually don't. One thing to keep in mind, tap water often contains chlorine, so be careful because it can damage your yeast. Use purified or filtered water if you're baking bread for best results. Now we have yeast. And here you have some options. If your starter is really active and you're okay with waiting a little bit longer, then just go with 1 teaspoon. If you're like me and you're not a patient guy, then use 2 teaspoons. I'm using SAF instant yeast here. We also have 2.5 teaspoons of salt. In my case, I'm using King Arthur bread salt. And I'm also using something called bread dough improver. This is good if you're making a couple of loaves and you want the bread to keep longer. It has enzymes in it that help the bread stay fresh. And finally, 600 grams, or about 5 cups of flour. Now you can use all-purpose flour. I recommend bread flour, and in fact I prefer to use a 50-50 mix of bread flour and high-gluten flour. I use King Arthur bread flour and Glick's high-gluten flour. You could probably also use artisan flour. I like this mix in particular because with the high-gluten, I think it gives the bread a better structure. So that was the software. Now let's take a look at the hardware you're going to need. First, you're going to need a mixer, one with a good bread hook. I'm using the Nutrimil Artiste. This is my go-to mixer for making bread. It's really powerful and it handles heavy bread doughs really well. My KitchenAid, while being a very good mixer, would struggle and even get hot when I was using it for bread. So I switched to the Nutrimil pretty much exclusively for doing bread now. You're going to need an oiled container so you can put your dough in there for its first rise. You'll need baking sheets with some sort of lining, either parchment paper or silicone, a scale. Measuring by weight rather than by volume is always better when you're baking. I mean, baking is a very scientific process, and it's actually one of the things that I love about it. You'll need a wire whisk and a cooling rack. A spray bottle for giving the loaves a spritz before they go into the oven. And then not pictured is a bench knife, a sifter for sprinkling some flour, and you're also going to need something to slash the bread before it goes into the oven, like a bread lame, which is a fancy French tool that you can use if you want to feel like a real baker. It's basically a razor blade on a stick. If you don't have one, you could use, an actual razor blade, or even a really sharp knife. Now before we get started, I would like to say please like and subscribe if you enjoy these videos. Let me know in the comments down below if you subscribed and if you plan on giving this bread a try. Or if you did try it, let me know how it turned out. Well, it's time to assemble the ingredients and start putting everything together. There's really nothing special about doing this or about mixing this. First, if you notice, I've got all my ingredients here, and what I'm going to do first is take all the dry ingredients and mix them together. This is just to kind of get it incorporated before it goes into the mixing bowl. So I'll take my flour and I'll add to it the rest of these dry ingredients, and then give it a good whisking so that it's nicely incorporated. Next, I'm going to open up my mixer here and then grab the starter and pour it into the mixing bowl. Now it's time to incorporate the dry ingredients. So I'm going to dump them in here, try to distribute them around the bowl a little bit, and try not to make too big a mess. Once it's in there, turn the mixer on low, get it started so the flour and the starter begin to kind of incorporate, and then slowly start adding in the water. Now you put in about a cup of water and let the mixer run for a little bit, and it'll start hydrating the dough. Now 1 cup is not going to be enough, but the dough should start clumping up and pulling together. Once that happens, slowly start adding in more water. I'm going to add about another 1/4 cup and let it mix a bit longer until the dough starts pulling away from the edges of the bowl. Now, if you're in a low humidity environment, the dough seems too dry, add the rest of the water. Now, we're going to let this mix for around 8 to 10 minutes until it starts looking like bread dough. And you can tell the dough is ready by giving it a pull and see if it stretches. If it tears or if it breaks easily, you need to run the mixer a little bit longer, a few more minutes, and then keep trying again. If you're familiar with the window pane test, you can use that as well. And as zen as it might be to sit here and watch this mixer go round and round and round, I'm going to speed things up so we can get on to the next step. So you may have noticed that I added a bit more water, if you caught it in all that, fast forwarding. This was because my dough was still a little bit dry. The weather here has been somewhat cooler, so I guess less humidity. So I'm going to stop the mixer, and I'm also going to give the dough a few turns of hand kneading until I'm happy with the way the dough looks. Now once the dough is ready, it needs to proof, which is a fancy way of saying that we need to let the yeast and the sourdough do its thing. You take it out of the mixing bowl, form it into a ball. The dough should be tacky, but not so sticky that you can't handle it. Roll it around in your hands a few times and place it in the oiled container, flipping it to oil the top and the bottom. I usually use an olive oil-based spray. The purpose of the oil really is to lubricate the container so that the dough doesn't tear and damage the structure while it rises. And of course, it also makes it a lot easier to take out of the bowl once it's finished proofing. Put it in a warm spot, let the dough rise until it's doubled. Now, this is usually going to be about 90 minutes, but that really depends on how warm your area is. During the summer, for example, I often put this in our garage where it can get a really good rise within about 60 minutes or so because it's very warm out there. So it just depends on your circumstances. That what you're looking for is the dough to look like it's about double in size.
So now it's proofed. Your bread should have doubled in size, and you're ready to work with it. Now, I've never been a big fan of the idea of punching down bread dough. Now, in some cases, it's necessary that you have to remove all the air from the dough. But in this particular case, with what we're working with, we really want to retain a lot of that puffiness because we want these loaves to have a nice, rustic-looking, airy crumb. So dump the risen dough out on the counter and really only worry about removing any of the really big bubbles that would create two really big gaps in the bread. Use a sharp bench knife and divide the dough in half. And now you can get creative. You can shape this bread pretty much any way you want. You can do a boule, which is a fancy term for a round loaf of bread. You could do an oval, like a rustic loaf. You can do kind of a cigar-shaped loaf. I even used my Italian loaf pans to make a longer loaf shape similar to the Cuban or French bread. Regardless, once you form it into whatever shape you prefer, put it on a piece of parchment on a baking sheet, and then take it back to your warm spot, cover it with plastic or a tea towel, and let it rise again. This time you're going to let it rise for about 60 minutes, up to 60 minutes, or until it's almost double and very puffy. Around 20 minutes before you think the loaves will be ready, prepare the oven by moving the rack to the center and preheating it to 425 degrees. Now that your bread is proofed, you should take it and use a spray bottle with filtered or purified water and spritz down each loaf. Once that's done, lightly sift a dusting of flour over each loaf. Now you're going to slash the loaves. Now I use a nice lame, I believe is how it's pronounced, I'm not sure, but it's basically a razor blade. I found this on Amazon, but you can use a clean razor blade or a very sharp knife. But this is a very important step because slashing the bread allows it to expand without tearing. I've had some awful rips down the sides of loaves that I didn't slash deep enough. Once that's done, you're ready to put it in the oven. Put them in the oven for 25 to 30 minutes until they're golden brown. You can remove them now and place them on a cooling rack. Or I can share a secret. If you prefer a slightly crispier crust, turn the oven off, but leave the bread in the oven for another 15 to 20 minutes with the oven door cracked open just a little bit. This will cause the crust to be a little bit harder. Now comes the even harder part though, patience. Now you have to let the loaves cool for 30 to 45 minutes before you cut them. So hold off, you can't eat it yet. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. This is really one of my very favorite breads and my favorite bakes, and it's been a hit with pretty much everyone I've shared it with. I hope you like it. I hope you've enjoyed watching. And if you haven't already, please hit the like button and the subscribe button to the channel. I greatly appreciate it. Let me know in the comments if you did that. Check the description below for any links to some of the ingredients and the hardware that I might have used. And then finally, if you made the bread, enjoy it and have a great day.